A childcare centre in Australia can generate close to $4 million a year in revenue, and after wages, rent and compliance costs, the owner might walk away with $400,000. That's a real number, not a rounded-up sales pitch. But here's the catch nobody tells you before you sign a lease. The exact same centre, run badly, can lose money every single month, even with a full waiting list. So what actually separates a childcare centre that's genuinely profitable from one that's underwater despite being fully booked? Let's go through the real numbers: startup costs, licensing, staffing, fees, and margins, because the answer isn't what most people assume. Let's start with what it actually costs to open the doors. Building a childcare centre from scratch in Australia typically costs somewhere between $1,500 and $3,000 per square metre for construction alone, and that's before land, design, and approvals. If you go the modular build route, cost per licensed place generally runs $19,000 to $28,000 in Victoria, $22,000 to $31,000 in New South Wales, and up to $34,000 per place in Western Australia. For a 100-place centre, that's a multi-million-dollar build before a single child walks through the door. Here's the number that surprises almost every new operator. It's not the construction cost that blows out the budget. It's the time. A childcare centre can take 6 to 12 months to actually open, purely because of regulation and licensing, not construction delays. That's 6 to 12 months of holding costs, rent and loan repayments with zero revenue coming in. So let's talk about why licensing takes that long. You'd think getting a permit for a childcare centre would be similar to any other small business. It's nowhere close. Every childcare provider in Australia operates under the National Quality Framework, and before you can open, you need two separate approvals: provider approval, which covers your fitness as an operator and your financial capacity, and then service approval, specific to that individual centre. Provider approval alone typically takes around 60 days from a complete application, and that's assuming nothing is missing. On top of that, your local council needs to sign off through a development application, checking things like ventilation, outdoor space, and accessibility standards specific to childcare use. Every single staff member needs a valid Working with Children check, and your educators need to meet ACE's minimum qualification standards, Certificate 3, diploma level, or a Bachelor of Early Childhood Education, depending on their role. You also need to maintain specific educator-to-child ratios by age group, and that ratio, more than almost anything else, determines your entire staffing cost structure. Here's a question worth asking yourself. If you're seriously considering this, have you actually mapped out your staffing plan against the ratio requirements for every age group? Or are you assuming you'll figure that out once you're open? Now let's get into the real cost driver, because it's not rent and it's not resources. By far, the biggest expense in a childcare centre is wages and on costs. Everything else is secondary. And wages in this sector are moving fast. From March 2026, significant changes to award wages and staff classifications took effect across the entire early childhood sector following a Fair Work Commission decision. On top of that, the federal government's worker retention payment funds a pay increase of 10% above award from December 2024, rising to 15% above award through November 2026, and providers are required to pass that increase directly onto eligible staff. Here's the contrast worth sitting with. You'd think a wage subsidy from the government would be pure good news for an operator. It's not automatically. If your fee structure hasn't been adjusted to account for the higher wage floor, that increase comes straight out of your margin, not the government's pocket. And staffing isn't just expensive, it's unstable. Staff turnover for early childhood teachers and educators in Australia has ranged between 20 and 37% a year, with the lower figure in metro areas and the higher figure in rural and remote services. That's not a minor operational headache, that's losing up to a third of your workforce annually, and every replacement hire means recruitment cost, training time, and a gap in experience on the floor. Let's move to revenue, because this is where the number that matters most comes in. Average daily fees for centre-based long-day care vary significantly by city. In Melbourne, the average sits around $160 a day, ranging from under $130 in outer suburbs to over $190 in premium inner suburbs. In Sydney, fees run higher again, generally between $150 and $210 a day before subsidy. Here's where it gets interesting. The government's childcare subsidy has an hourly cap, and from July 2026, that cap sits at $15.19 an hour for long daycare. If you charge above that cap, families pay the full gap on every dollar above it, with no subsidy covering the difference. That single number, the CCS cap, effectively sets a ceiling on how aggressively you can raise fees before your own families start feeling it directly in their pocket. To put real numbers on this, a 100-place center running at 85% occupancy and charging around $120 a day generates roughly $3.7 million a year in revenue. That's not profit, that's the top line, before wages, rent, and everything else gets taken out. So, after everything, what's actually left over? Well-run childcare centers in Australia generally produce net profit margins somewhere between 12 and 20%. On that 100-place, $3.7 million center, a strong operator might net somewhere between $400,000 and $650,000 a year before the owner's own salary is factored in. Here's the comparison worth making. That margin range is actually solid compared to a lot of other small business categories in Australia. Many food and retail businesses operate on much thinner single-digit margins once rent and wages are stripped out. But childcare margins come with a catch. They're almost entirely dependent on occupancy and staffing efficiency. Drop occupancy by 10 or 15%, or lose a run of experienced staff, and that 12 to 20% margin can evaporate fast. This is also why the sector attracts serious buyers. Childcare businesses in Australia typically sell for 3 to 5 times EBITDA, with well-located metro centres at high occupancy reaching 4.5 to 5 times. Per licensed place, that translates to values from $15,000 in regional areas up to $45,000 in major cities. Big institutional players, names like G8 Education, Good Start, and Guardian Early Learning, along with private equity firms, have been actively competing for these assets, which tells you something important. This sector is seen as genuinely investable, not just a lifestyle business. Now, the part that doesn't show up in the glossy investment summaries. The educator shortage in Australia isn't a minor talking point. It's described by the sector itself as a genuine workforce crisis. Vacancies for early childhood educators increased by over 13% in a single year, and centres are losing not just entry-level staff, but experienced educators and mentors, the people who train everyone else. When that experience walks out the door, it doesn't come back easily. Add to that the rising wage floor we already covered, ongoing ratio and qualification compliance that never really stops once you're licensed, and competition from large, well-capitalized providers expanding into the same suburbs you're targeting. And here's a question worth sitting with if you're weighing this up seriously. Is your center in a genuine childcare desert, an area where demand already outstrips supply? Or are you opening into a suburb where 3 larger, better-funded competitors already have the market covered? So, is owning a childcare center in Australia actually profitable? Based on everything we've gone through, yes, genuinely, and often more profitable than people expect, with margins that hold up well against other small business categories, backed by a revenue stream that's unusually predictable because a large portion of it comes directly from a federal subsidy rather than from chasing customers who might not pay. But it only works under specific conditions. It works best at high occupancy, meaning location and reputation matter enormously before you even open. It works best when your fee structure is actively managed against the CCS cap and the rising wage floor, not set once and forgotten. And it works best when you treat staffing, not fit out, not resources, as the single biggest thing you manage, because wages are your largest cost and your highest risk at the same time. Buying an existing, already occupied center generally beats building from scratch because you skip the 6 to 12-month licensing runway with no revenue. And running it hands-on with real attention to ratios and retention consistently outperforms a purely passive ownership